Hello and welcome to Serious Coin, the podcast where we have rich conversations about wealth. I'm Kelly Willis Green. Now, this episode is about a topic that is anxiety producing for a lot of wealthy parents. How much money should I leave my kids? How do I talk to them about wealth? And how do I get them ready to receive it? But I want to help tame some of that anxiety. In this episode, we'll give you food for thought, some practical advice, and real-life examples of what some families are doing, because I know we're always curious about what other people are doing. I can tell you I've long wanted to do an episode on this subject, but I was waiting for the perfect guest. And then I found him in Matthew Wesley. Matt is a principal at the Lovins Group, where he helps wealthy families, some of the most prominent in the world, sort through these complex questions every single day. Generational transition, family culture, governance. He's seen it all. He's done it all. His career spans 34 years as an estate planning attorney, an advisor, a consultant. Matt's worked with wealth creators in Silicon Valley during the dot-com era. And he himself comes from an enterprising family. Matt also has a master's in divinity, and he will tell you his pastoral skills come into play in a big way in this line of work. No wonder he's also a respected thought leader and speaker internationally. Matt joined me from his home just outside Seattle. Have a listen as he explains how people deal with the anxiety around this issue and why he thinks we're asking the wrong question when we ask, how much should I leave my kids?
So you're dealing with this, massive anxiety system when you raise this question. And what do people do when they're anxious? Well, they tend to either flee, they don't want to deal with it, they avoid it, they tend to, fight about it, or they tend to flock. They tend to gather with other people and find out what's going on and what they're doing. Hey, what are you doing? And how are you doing this? And how are you navigating it?
Exactly. And so that's what this podcast episode is about, really an opportunity for people who are listening who may be in this position themselves and they want to know what other people are doing. So could you frame that then in your practice? What are you seeing when people come in to have these conversations with you? What's on their minds? What are the most common questions that you get?
Well, when I started out as an estate planning attorney, the question that would always come up, I was working with a lot of young people in the Silicon Valley who'd come into tremendous amounts of money through stock options and such. And the big question they were always asking was, how much should I leave my kids? And about that same time, Warren Buffett came up with, leave your kids enough to do anything, but not so much that they can do nothing, which sounds very wise, but it doesn't give you a whole lot of guidance in terms of what that number is.
No.
And so I was flummoxed by that. And it's kind of like, how do I answer this question that is clearly on people's minds? It's funny. I remember sitting with one client and he had children who were 9 and 13. And he asked me that question and the meeting was going really well. So I felt I could be a little bit bold. And I said, why wouldn't you want to prepare them so that they could handle everything? And he looked at me and he said, that's really true. And so what it did was that put me on the track, the notion that we're asking the wrong question. When we ask the quantitative question, how much should I leave my kids? It's the wrong question. The real question is, how ready are they to receive it? And how do we think about their readiness to receive what it is that they're going to get? And how do we put our energy and attention into preparing them for the inheritance that they'll ultimately receive?
That does beg the question, how do you then help families prepare their kids?
That's a great question. I want to back up for a second because you asked earlier, what are people doing out there? And we did a little study when I was at Merrill Lynch on this, and it turned out that about 12% of the people or so were not giving their kids much of anything, a little bit to, kind of launch them, and then the rest would go to charity. The vast bulk, probably 60 to 70%, were setting up trusts for them. And those trusts could last for a very long time, in some of the cases with really wealthy families. They're multi-generational dynastic trusts with complex structures around them, like private offices, family offices, and trust companies and stuff like that. For smaller clients, it's money that's going to be managed by institutions. What some clients did, and I would say it was another 12 to 20%, were doing what we called growth plans, which was that they were going to turn the whole thing over to the kids and they were going to help the kids be ready for it. And the reason we called it growth plans was because it depended a lot on the growth and the development of the beneficiaries. And one of the things that is buried in here that I don't think people pay very much attention to is the reality of what a trust is. If you ask most wealth creators, what is it that they fear most about transferring the assets to their kids? They would say, I don't want my kids to be entitled.
Yeah.
Right? That's the big fear. Well, the interesting thing about a trust is that it legally, factually entitles people to the beneficial use of that money. So by creating a trust, they're actually creating the conditions in which they're setting up entitlement. And so they're caught on the horns of a dilemma. And the problem with trusts, if you look at them deeply, is that the trustee has a whole bunch of obligations. They have fiduciary obligations. They have to be loyal. They have to invest wisely. They have to distribute wisely. There are a lot of legal things on the side of the trustee that need to flow. The interesting thing is that there is nothing like that on the beneficiary side. The beneficiary doesn't have duties or responsibilities. They get to enjoy the wealth. And so the challenge that families face is, how are we going to create, for want of a better term, a moral counterweight that's going to be equal to the legal obligations of the fiduciary, so that when the beneficiary comes to their trust, they're empowered and equipped to manage that well, and they have a sense of responsibility about what it means to be a beneficiary. And so these families that are really taking this growth path are really focused in on that question of, how do we get the beneficiaries ready? And I think, a huge part of that has to do with character and the character of the beneficiary. I've often said that if you give me a beneficiary with good character, we can work really hard to build up the skills and the competencies to be able to handle that well. But if they're not, well-grounded, mature, have some wisdom and discretion, it's going to be really hard to make up for that.
And that's going to differ in a family as well.
It is. And so figuring out how to navigate that within the family becomes a challenge. And there are a number of different ways to deal with that. But one is to separate out the administration of the money after somebody is gone from the fairness question. So oftentimes people say, well, I don't want to treat my children differently because it's unfair. But the problem is, your kids are different. They're wired differently. They have different interests. Even if you've got two really responsible kids, you might have one child who is an artist and a great artist and loves art, but has no interest in sitting down with a financial advisor and talking about their investments. Whereas the other kid, it loves that stuff and will spend all day poring over stock tables and really is intrigued by it. So the reality is, you have to approach the kids a little bit differently. And the way that we have seen some parents navigate this pretty successfully is to say, look, we're going to treat you fairly. You're going to get an equal amount. The question of what form that's going to take and what the terms of your trust are going to be different based on what we see kind of coming from you. Because if you're not prepared to receive this, it's not going to be good for you. And so the responsibility for how these things are administered falls more on the side of the children and their attention to being ready for this, so that when mom and dad pass, they, in a sense, have no one else but themselves to blame for how that trust was set up and what the restrictions are.
Can you give me an example of how you've seen this work successfully?
Yeah, sure. There, at one family that we worked with, there was some addiction and it was not good, probably some mental illness wrapped into that. And the parents said to that child, look, until you get a handle on this, until you're ready to do it, this would be a recipe for disaster to hand you control of the trust.
Mm-hmm.
But it wasn't fair to treat their other child who was doing really well and was actually in financial services and understood how money worked and how trust worked and all that. So that child got a whole lot more discretion over their trust distributions and the investments than the child who had these addiction issues.
Another challenge with many estate plans is that they are primarily tax-driven. Matt says people get mesmerized by the reduction of estate taxes. Now, that may be one of your objectives, but he says you need to have a guiding principle in mind.
In reality, if you're thinking about this well as a parent, what you're doing is you're thinking about it as from a perspective of love. And what is the most loving thing to do for the people that you're leaving this incredible energy to, potentially dangerous, potentially powerfully profound in terms of the good it could do. And so thinking about that in the context of love is the
driving value, the principle.
Exactly. And so asking yourself, what is the most loving thing to do here? And I think as a lawyer, what I recognized was that when people came into my office, they had multiple things on their mind as parents and as philanthropists and as whatever. And for many lawyers, they have a single focus, which is this reduction of estate taxes. They're technicians oftentimes.
Right.
And so the problems that cascade from that, if that's the way they approach it, is not so good. Now, fortunately, I think the estate planning field is changing and people are beginning to recognize that there's a lot more going on that they need to be paying attention to. But it's a slow evolution, and some lawyers are really open to that, and some are just kind of like, well, my job is to reduce estate taxes.
I can echo that, because I remember from wealth management, we would have clients come in with their estate plan, and our people would take a look at it and explain it to them and say, do you realize this is what's going to happen? And they didn't even understand or really know the impact and outcome of the estate plan. It was driven by tax.
Yeah, exactly.
I want to ask you about that 12% that doesn't plan to leave very much to their kids, because there are a number of high-profile people who've said they don't plan to leave their children a large inheritance. Anderson Cooper, Ashton Kutcher, Daniel Craig Sting.
Yeah.
I think they've all said to varying degrees that their kids will not receive enough of an inheritance that they won't have to work.
I'm certainly not going to second judge anybody who has that philosophy. They know their family, they know their own values, and they know what's going to likely work for them and for their families. If you've done a really good job of preparing your kids for the wealth is probably better off in the hands of your children than it is in the hands of strangers. So if your kids have a wisdom and capability and they're working at something, they're contributing in a meaningful way to the world, why wouldn't you want them to be the ones that are controlling the disposition of that capital?
I guess sometimes I hear the answer to that is I don't want to deprive them of the joy and opportunity to create their own wealth.
Yeah, exactly. And there is that. I mean, again, I'm not going to second judge anybody on that. I think it largely depends on how you talk about it with your kids and how you set that up. And are you able to forecast what your decisions are going to do to family dynamics and family relationships over the long haul? I've worked with one family where it wasn't a vast amount of wealth, but it was certainly significant. And the dad said, went to all the kids. The youngest was 18 at the time, and said, Mom and I are planning on leaving you $5 million each, and then the rest of it's going to go to charity. And all the kids said, that sounds great. And then I came on the scene about 10 years later. So now the youngest child is 28, right? Very different life stage, very different perspective on what this could all mean. And I said to the patriarch, Are you willing to revisit this? And he said, yeah, sure. If they want more, they can have more. And so I went to the kids and I said, what do you think? Your dad's planning on leaving you $5 million. He's willing to give you more if you want it. What do you think? And they all said to a person, there were 3 kids, and they all said, we don't want it. We don't know what we would do with it. And we love the idea that this is going to go to philanthropy, right? So it's like, that's not a problem.
That's lovely, actually.
Yeah, I've run into other families and, it feeds into a pattern of parental neglect. The same people that are bringing you this estate plan are the people who brought you latchkey kids. And so for a lot of kids, it's like, why do mom and dad care more about strangers than they do about our own family? And so there's hurt, there's resentment, there's anger. And so if you can communicate about it in a way that is going to be collaborative, I think you have a better chance, assuming the family can have those kinds of conversations.
But I do think, too, like there must be a real moral question here. What is the responsibility of a parent who raises a child in an extremely privileged lifestyle only because that is the parent's lifestyle? Household staff, multiple residences, first-class travel, private jets, access to all the experiences. And some might say then you're creating financial hardship by not providing them with the means to continue that lifestyle, because let's face it, it's pretty tough to create that on your own.
I think you're spot on in raising that as a legitimate question. And again, the way most estate planning works is that people go behind closed doors with their attorney and they say, I've got a problem. I've got a lot of money and I've got to get this down to my kids and I don't know how to do it responsibly. What are we going to do? And they sit behind closed doors and they try to make those decisions. And most often it's based on a bunch of assumptions, a bunch of guesswork, a bunch of forecasting into the future. Warren Buffett has said, and I think he's absolutely right in this, that estate planning is no longer an individual problem, it's a family problem. So how do we begin to engage in a conversation as a family about what is the purpose of this wealth and how does this wealth function in our lives? And how can we be responsible stewards with it? How can we enjoy it in a way that's responsible? How can we live out our own dreams and our own approach to life? And those are 3 big questions that beneficiaries face all the time. They're always asking, what's expected of me? What can I expect? What do I expect from myself? And all of those questions are bubbling around in them, and they never get a chance to talk about that stuff. And so why not open that to a family conversation and begin to do estate planning collaboratively? So rather than saying, as a wealth creator, I've got a problem, they turn it and they say, we've got a problem. Just this week, I was in a family meeting and the dad had been going round and round and round in his own mind, creating spreadsheet after spreadsheet about how to transfer a family business to his kids. And so we said, hey, why don't we get together? You can kind of give them some parameters, and then the 3 kids will talk about it and come up with a proposal as to how to do the estate plan in a way that's going to work for them.
Were the 3 kids involved in the business?
Yeah, one was not, and she wasn't in the meeting, but the others were. And they came up with this beautiful plan. And the dad listened to it and he said, yeah, you've heard me and you've heard my concerns, and these are good solutions. There's details to be worked out still about timing and transfers of stock ownership and things like that. But I have always been floored by how responsible kids are when they talk about wealth in a facilitated environment. And the thing I see with wealth creators when you do that is this huge weight comes off them because they've been carrying this thing.
Of course.
And are afraid to move left or right because of the potential negative consequences it's going to have in the lives of their children. And when their children come to them and give them permission, it's like, okay, this is great.
It was apparent to me while I was talking to Matt that it's really too late to leave those big questions of how much and when to pass on wealth for that first meeting with your estate lawyer. You really want to have some strategic clarity before that. You may want to involve your children, as he suggests. Matt says there are 2 or 3 other questions people should be asking themselves as they start down this path of intergenerational transfer.
So I think that before you sit down with your kids, you have to decide how it's going to be decided. I've had some clients who have said, look, I don't care. My kids tell me what they want in the estate plan. I'll go to the lawyer and have it drafted up, right? Others say, well, I want to consult with them and I'm going to be the final decision maker here. They'll have some input, but it's ultimately up to me. Other people kind of take a middle ground and they'll say, look, it has to be a consensus. I have to agree to it. They have to agree to it. We want agreements. So I think one of the first questions is how much control do you really want to have in this process? And what are you asking your kids to do? And are you clear on that? Because if the kids come in thinking this is a consensus process and it's really a consultative one where dad's going to make the ultimate decisions, you're setting it up for potential conflict down the road. Another thing I would say is it's really important for spouses to have these conversations before you bring them up with the kids. The last thing you want to do is bring the kids into conversations that the spouses haven't had themselves. And I often find that sometimes spouses have a great deal of wisdom about how kids are going to respond and how they're going to interact with these things that maybe the other parent is not paying attention to. And so how do you calibrate that and anticipate it before you actually get in the room? That's why oftentimes these conversations are so much better when they're facilitated by somebody who knows what they're doing.
I would think so. The other thing that comes to my mind is, shouldn't you know going in, what is the wealth for?
Yeah.
As a guiding principle?
Yeah. Yeah. And getting clear on that yourself, getting clear on that with the spouse, getting clear on that with your kids is really important. That's kind of, there's that old adage that you can put ladders up to reach your goals, but if your ladder is against the wrong wall, you're in real trouble. And so what's the wall you're trying to climb? And then the ladder makes sense. What's the wall the family's trying to climb? Is it to secure the promise of the American dream for future generations? Is it to benefit the world? And that may sound a little hyperbolic, but when you think about it, that generational transition, every generational transition, the next generation is facing a core challenge, a core adaptive challenge. So oftentimes what we see is wealth creators saying they want the next generation to be entrepreneurial, when in fact, in most cases, not all cases, but in most cases, that entrepreneurial work has been done. They've done it, right? And the point isn't to replicate what they did. The challenge in the next generation is, if they're going to retain the wealth, is how do we become enterprising, right? How do we take this capital and deploy it wisely and use it well to build on it, for sure. But it is really a very different challenge, requiring very different skill sets and very different competencies.
I think that's a really important point that many wealth creators, entrepreneurs in particular, probably forget, because on one hand, they maybe don't want their kids to struggle as much as they did.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, they don't want entitlement. As you said, that was what you led with. They want them to build and be great.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I've run into wealth creators who want their kids to work and work hard. That's the important thing. Usually what's behind that is a desire to have their kids contribute, right? That they're making some sort of meaningful contribution. And when I talk to wealth creators all the time, they say, I really don't care if my kid stays home and raises their kids, as long as they're happy and productive and doing that well. Ran into one matriarch. It was beautiful. She was a wife of a first generation wealth creator, and she was talking with her financial advisor, and she said, and the financial advisor said, well, you want your kids to work hard and have a good work ethic. And she just looked at her and she said, sweetie, that's lovely, but you do not understand. She said, my kids will never have to lift a finger if they don't want to. Said, but what I want for them is to become excellent heiresses. It's like, whoa, that is a loaded word, heiress, right?
Yes.
Visions of all sorts of bad behavior come up with that one. She said, and here's what I mean by that. I mean that they're a pillar in their community, that they're respected and admired for the charitable work they do, for the way that they exemplify grace and kindness, that they're raising kids who are responsible, so on and so forth. She had a whole picture of what she meant by being an excellent heiress. And I said to myself at the time, this is a woman who has made peace with the fact that the life her children are living is in a very different world than the world that she was in. And she had made peace with that. And I think that's part of the journey of the wealth creator in this. If they're going to be leaving wealth to their kids, is how do I make peace with the fact that the world that my children are living in is a very different world than I'm living in? And how do I set them up for success in that new world?
I thought that last comment was insightful and very wise. Making peace that your children will have a very different set of challenges than you did as the wealth creator. And understanding that the skill sets and resources that they'll need to succeed will also be different than what you needed. And I wondered whether Matt sees differences between how first-generation wealth creators view the question of how much to give their kids versus multi-generational families.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think the hardest transition for any family is the first to second generation transition. That's where lots of things become problematic. First of all, a lot of track has almost always been laid, right? They've got trusts that go on for multiple generations. And so the family's kind of stuck with them. And so the question is, how do we live well with the structures that have been created for us? They're there. The other thing is that if these transitions have gone well, what families create primarily in the second generation, it has its roots in the first, but in the second generation is they develop a culture. And to me, that culture drives a lot of individual behavior. I think the easiest way to change individual behavior is to shift the culture, because if you shift the culture, people will begin to act in ways that correspond to the new culture that's there.
I just want to ask, it surprises me that you say the hardest transition is from first to second, because we all know about the shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations.
Right.
And that second generation has watched the wealth being created. They see what goes into it and how difficult it is. That third generation is a little more removed from it. And I would have thought that would have been a harder transition.
So usually the dysfunctions of the first generation start really showing up in the second generation. By the third generation, they're in full-blown living technicolor. And so the hardest thing and it's true for the wealth creator and for the second generation, if they're going to get through that generation, they have to become a sibling team. And that is really, really hard. And it requires a whole set of skills that not only is not valued by the wealth creator, things like collaboration, cooperation, trust, long-term decision-making process, all those kinds of things, which for most first-generation wealth creators are fingernails on a chalkboard. So they not only don't value it, but oftentimes they kind of disdain those skills. And so the second generation, it's got an uphill struggle because it has to create something that wasn't created before. If they do that well, it will go down to the third generation, the patterns that they create and the way that they talk with one another and the way they do it. And part of the reason the wealth disappears in the shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves generation is because of lack of trust, lack of communication, lack of cohesion in the family, and it just fractures. And that's how families avoid the shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves things, is by getting it right in the second generation.
So Matt, I'm listening to you and I can't help wondering about your own family story. Did you grow up with money?
I grew up around a little bit of money. My grandfather set up a trust and it had enough to get me through a couple of graduate degrees and buy a home. It wasn't extraordinary wealth, but it was generated from a family business that my dad worked in. So my dad was a third generation family business. He ran one portion of the family business. It was a newspaper business. So he ran one of the papers. And so there was familiarity with the dynamics just from an early age, and kind of living not at anywhere near the levels that a lot of people have, but it was not insubstantial, and the dynamics were very parallel to what I see in these families.
Makes you more credible with your clients, I would think. I mean, it's just a beautiful combination of your personal and professional experience. I want to close, as I always do now, with just a few rapid fire questions about your personal view of money and wealth.
Sure.
What is one thing that people don't understand about what it's like to be wealthy until they actually are?
The level of complexity that's associated with this. I think most people think, well, gosh, if I get a lot of wealth, my life will be easier. And if anything, it's, the old adage, mo money, mo problems, right? They're good problems to have. And oftentimes there are problems money can solve. Sometimes they're not, right? The level of complexity is oftentimes, I think, shocking to people. The first hint of it is when they're selling their business and all of a sudden they're having to deal with estate planning. It's like, holy mackerel, what's going on here?
Welcome to your new life.
Yeah, exactly.
If you finish the sentence, to me, money is?
Money is energy.
What is one quality that's essential to be functional and well-adjusted around wealth?
Wow. This is almost oxymoronic, but developing a sense of equanimity. I think I have a pretty deep meditation / contemplative practice. And I think the reason I do that is because it allows, if you think of yourself in some way as empty space through which experience is moving, and that experience comes and goes, it creates a lot of space for groundedness and equanimity.
I really enjoyed speaking with Matt Wesley. I found him thoughtful and insightful and very down to earth. If you'd like to reach out to Matt about intergenerational transfer, you can find him at the Lovins Group, lovinsgroup.com, and I put a link to the website in the show notes. In the next episode of this season, I'll be talking to a third-generation inheritor about the ways she is preparing her fourth-generation children for the responsibilities of wealth. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss it when it drops. I'm Kelly Willis Green. You've been listening to Serious Coin, rich conversations about wealth. Serious Coin is provided for your general interest only, and nothing we discuss should be taken as investment, tax, legal, or other professional advice. Always talk to a licensed professional before you make any financial decisions.